Hello and welcome to the final Rugby Paper Podcast episode of 2024. Join myself and the full house of columnists as we review the weekend of the Champions Cup as well as discussing its format before presenting the podcast award for Team, Match and Player of the Year. Final episode of the year. We're winding down for 2024. Ideally, we would have the full house. Brendan has dipped in and out a few times and appears to be having some internet troubles, living near Gatwick Airport, which is fairly congested at this time of year, it's fair to say. We've had another weekend of Champions Cup action to review, but primarily we'll be doing the Rugby Paper Podcast 2024 awards, including player, match, team, and breakthrough, a podcast episode of the year. First of all, I think it's probably necessary that we say a little bit about Tom Voyce. We sort of mentioned it last week when the search was still ongoing. But the former England Wasps, Bath and Gloucester outside back, his body has been found, and he has lost his life in the aftermath of Storm Darragh. Our thoughts, as we said last week, are with his loved ones, his wife Anna and his son Oscar. Guys, he was, of course, part of that Wasp side in 2003, 2004. I think he started both finals. He was top try scorer in the league that year. What interactions did you have with him, if any, and if not, what memories do you have of him?
I saw him in Darwin once. When we were starting a holiday, it was after the England tour. I think it was Andy Robinson had led that tour, so it might have been 2006, I guess. And it had been an unhappy tour in many respects. And Tom was far from the biggest problem England had. In fact, it wasn't a problem at all. But we were chatting about the tour in Northern Territory, Australia, of all places on earth. And he was incredibly forthcoming with his opinions. He was bitterly disappointed at what had happened on the tour. He was very honest, and I always found him to be exactly that. If he chose to speak to you, and usually he did because he was unfailingly approachable and friendly, he would pretty much tell you what he thought and trust you not to get him into a load of trouble. And that was the kind of guy he was. As a player, he was, to my eye, far more influential, particularly in his high days with Wasps, than people gave him credit for. He was relatively low profile in the great scheme of things, in a side that had the Delarios and Simon Shaws and all those superstar types. But he always broke the first tackle. He wasn't the biggest, he wasn't the quickest, but he always broke the first tackle. And like wings of old, he knew where the try line was and found his way there an awful lot of times. So it's terrible news. He was a really, really nice guy and a far better player than the public prints reflected.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Particularly, those two European Cup winning Wasp sides. He was, I think he was a great finisher, Tom Voyce. And the thing that I always noticed about him was his ability to keep his feet in contact, because he wasn't the biggest guy, but he was very, very difficult to bring down, and also had the ability to offload out of the tackle if he wasn't making headway himself. I think that he was a great team player in great teams. Those two Wasp teams that won those Heineken Cups were great teams, and he played his part in a very talented, probably overall undersung, backline when you consider guys that he played with, like Fraser Waters. I think Fraser Waters might have got 2 England caps, and Tom managed to get a few more than that. And he fully merited them. And, as to approachable and clearly, somebody who was very much liked and loved. It's a great tragedy, really, and may he rest in peace.
Yeah, 100%. Brendan, do you have any? Well, did you ever talk?
Well, I just thought he was a guy who maximised his talent. Like Chris was saying, he wasn't the biggest, he wasn't the fastest, but he got, I think it was 70 tries, was it, in top grade rugby, 3 in his England appearances. And I saw a highlights reel the other day, somebody put up on social media. And yes, he did always beat the first player. He often beat the second. If he had a yard more gas, he would have been a sensational player, because if you can beat the first two, you're normally in space. And often he didn't quite have the pace to absolutely finish it off. But no, a hell of a good player who I suspect would have won many more caps with other nations at another time.
Yeah.
I think we should remind ourselves also that Wasp side was the epitome of the team. It was far greater than the sum of its parts as considered by the wider rugby public. Alex King was underrated. Fraser Walters was underrated. Tom Voyce certainly was underrated.
Mark Van Gisbergen was underrated. Stuart Abbott was underrated.
Absolutely. So they were a team. They were the definition of a team rather than a collection of individuals, and that's what made them as successful as they were. And actually, that's sort of the point of rugby, really. If you want to be an individual, you can go and play tennis.
Yeah, 100%. I think he was 3 Premiership titles that he won, 2 European titles as well, an Anglo-Welsh Cup too. And yeah, you're right. He was part of the great Wasp side of the early 2000s, mid 2000s. So no, and it's always telling as well, positively telling, when as many tributes come out as tributes have come out from all corners and all clubs he played for, and obviously the national side as well. So that at least has been heartwarming to see for a situation that doesn't warm the heart. So yeah, our thoughts are with his loved ones, and hopefully, we can remember his great career at the very least, and how great he was as a person. Guys, I think order of play today, we'll talk about the Champions Cup a little bit. Obviously, there's plenty to reflect on from the weekend before going into the Rugby Paper Podcast Awards for 2024. Champions Cup, first of all, on a slightly more positive note, a more successful weekend for English teams. Sarries and Northampton did the double and got back-to-back wins. Additional wins for Leicester Tigers, Harlequins and Sale Sharks. Out of those names, well, obviously, I think the performance of the weekend is fairly obvious from the broader tournament, but out of the English teams, what was the performance of the weekend? And that's a question to the floor.
Well, definitely Northampton. To go down to the Blue Bulls in Pretoria, and they were pretty much at full strength. They had travelled back during the week, so as had Northampton, so they were equal in terms of inconvenience. And actually, they had to weather a storm first half hour. It was a bloody poor match, actually, the first half hour. Nobody could do anything, but Bulls were in the ascendancy. A lot of defending had to be done. And then suddenly both sides clicked, and Northampton got their game together, and they were very good value for the win. And I think Northampton will kick on both in Europe and domestically now. I think that was a big win for them. Slightly serious looking injury to George Furbank, which might knock them a bit. But I think apart from that, they're in very good shape now.
Yeah.
Guys, do you agree?
I think they're in good shape. I don't see any Premiership side being European champions this season. I guess Saracens probably look the most likely lads at the moment. But overall, I think that the Premiership it's too up and down. There's a lot of inconsistency. I don't think that defensively that they're quite probably where they need to be. And but I'm worried about, and it's been voiced very clearly, I'm worried about the European Cup, definitely, because of, obviously the logistics with South Africa now being involved, and the fact that there are people, and it's not just the South Africans, there are other people who are putting up B teams or A teams rather than their full strength sides in what is meant to be the crown jewel tournament in Europe, and it's undervaluing it, and devaluing it massively. The Stormers, the Sharks. I mean, Plumtree's stuff after their defeat. I thought it was pretty poor. Saying our players aren't robots. Look, they wanted in, and the logistics of it seem to me to have been badly sorted. It shouldn't be beyond them to be able to get a schedule where they come up for 2 weeks and sides go down there for 2 weeks, but it seems to be beyond them at the moment. But ultimately, if they want to play in it, they've got to make the accommodations to make sure that they bring competitive sides to the party. And that applies right across the board, because English clubs are doing it too. And so, and so are French. So they either, recognize that this competition should be the crown jewel of what we have, or let's get rid of it, because, and that, I mean, I think that would be the equivalent of rugby blowing both its feet off. I mean, it's been a fantastic competition, and it's being devalued by poor administration, and which is not galvanizing the tournament as it should be, particularly in terms of its format.
Yeah.
The absolute core problem, Nick, is okay. So the South Africans, and I'm ethically against that. It's a European competition. Put that to one side. Practically, what it means is that the European Cup has had to go away from the tried and tested formula, which almost by accident produced great rugby, and that was 6 pools of 4. Winner qualifies, 2 best runners up. Now that doesn't sound promising, but that is what done it. And the South Africans, you cannot have South Africa in a tournament with that.
They got away from that format before the South Africans came.
Yes, COVID. They did it for COVID. And then they kept it because they wanted South Africa in, and South African teams cannot be expected to travel up to Europe 3 times, home and away matches, either side of Christmas, on top of URC. So that means that format is off the table. And that format was the competition. It was absolutely perfect. It meant that you had to win the pool or get the 2 best runners up, which meant you had to put out pretty good sides in almost every pool match. You got the home and aways, 3rd and 4th, round 3 and 4, which were brilliant. They were normally the pool deciders. You had the mathematical fight up and on the final day. You could have the occasional, you could get away with sending a weaker side in the old days, perhaps to Benetton, and still win the pool, and it didn't upset anybody too much. It was perfect. That format has gone. This format is rubbish. And the reason we've got this format is it's the only way South Africa can be accommodated. And I accept it was brought in during COVID, but it's been kept because it's the only way the South Africans be included, and it's destroying the competition.
Was it Racing last year that got through with 1 win and 3 defeats? Or am I making that
Somebody
up?
did, yeah. Somebody did.
Yeah, but I'm afraid that I see it as a wider problem than that. I think that the stretching the competition to 7 and 8 teams out of leagues, so that 8 Premiership sides qualify, and 2 go into the Challenge Cup. It's too many. There aren't 8 sides of that quality in the Premiership. It should be 4, maximum 5.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, what it used to be with the old format was 48 group games to eliminate 72 group games to eliminate 12 teams. Now it's 48 to eliminate 8 teams, which is even then is a lower percentage. So we speak about lack of jeopardy, and we did mention this last week, and I think it certainly ticks that box. The other thing is, for some reason, I wondered whether you guys had a take on why this reason might be. Last year in the opening pool of fixtures, or the opening 2 rounds, there were 11 one-score games across the opening 2 rounds. This time, there were 4. Obviously, we've seen some squash matches. We've seen 2 South African teams ship 50 points, for Christ's sake. Why is it? Do you think there's a devaluation one year to the next, and that's why these A teams, these B teams are showing up, or do you think that's unfortunate coincidence?
I think teams do work out how much they can afford to lose and still make a round of 16.
Yeah. Totally.
But with this, and actually, we've been talking about wasps. I remember talking to Lawrence Delalio forever ago, and he was saying, well, without the playoffs, and it was a time when there was some controversy about whether the Premiership should be going back to a straight league or we should be sticking with the playoffs. And Lawrence basically said, well, if it was a straight league, we'd have taken some games more seriously than we did. But we would do what's necessary to be in the playoffs. Because and that means that you can manage your squad in a different way, probably in a way more beneficial to yourself. I put the point to him that you're expecting people to pay top dollar. By definition, you're expecting to pay people, expecting your supporters to pay top dollar to watch a game that you're not trying to lose it, obviously, but it's not a must-win game, and they're assuming it is. And at the start of the season, when rugby supporters looked at the fixture list, see who they were drawn against in the Champions Cup, they would have bought their season tickets in the good faith that those were going to be proper matches. Bugger me. The Bulls effectively threw a knockout match last year.
Yeah.
Last season.
Yeah.
Because Jake White said, we can't do the travelling. They shouldn't be in the tournament. It is preposterous. Utterly preposterous. That, there's a good reason why the England Cricket Board don't have Guyana in the county championship. In fact, there are a number of good reasons. This is ridiculous. To be flying those distances for one or indeed even two games, actually, if you manage to reshape the fixture list to suit the South Africans. I don't see why we're bending over backwards to suit the South Africans. Seriously. I do not understand it.
And what is it financially they are bringing to this tournament? Because that was the only reason for doing this. What is it they're bringing financially?
It's money. It's a bloody joke. And this sport will sell its soul for a few quid. It will.
I think that they are bringing money to it, and that's so that's an added complication, if you like. The super sport element, I think, is pretty considerable in terms of income. So, look, I don't know how that pot is divvied up. Obviously at the moment, the tournament itself, from being an absolute shining light, that light is being extinguished rapidly. And this idea that the absolute incredulity that I have that they're going to shelve, or that there are plans to shelve the tournament at the before the knockout stage or at the quarterfinal stage, to then become a World Club Championship tournament every fourth year, is absolutely barking mad. It just kills the credibility of the tournament stone dead. I mean, the administrative cock-ups that proliferate in this game are just mind-boggling.
In what parallel universe, if you're Ulster, do you send a mix and match team down to Toulouse? Bloody hell, that should be your Everest for the season. Regardless, you're not going to win probably, but you go down there and you test yourself. It's the European Champions Cup. It's the old Heineken Cup. You don't send a bloody ragbag 15 down there to get hammered 60 something. It's a nonsense.
Yeah, and you look at the Sharks side. Khaleesi and Che, Esterhazen were all fit. There was a decision to rest them. They've got injuries. They've got an injury list, quite a long one. But if those three had been playing in that side, that result would not have been like that.
Yeah. Stormers were the same. I think they rotated out. So their injury list is even longer, but they rotated out 6 too.
Yeah.
And the South African side shipped 139 points over the weekend, which, given that they're the powerhouse nation in world rugby at the moment, is pretty. It sort of puts things into perspective.
But it's the overall picture you have to look at, Ollie. I'm old enough to remember weekend when there's been no Premiership wins and they've done badly, and indeed sometimes no French wins and no Irish wins. That happens. But what can't be allowed to happen is have the structure that it is now, because it's going to happen time and time again now if we stay like this.
Yeah. Let's
and of course,
somewhat. Sorry,
not only this, but their decision to go north rather than east or west, depending on what way around the world you want to fly. The decision to try and hitch their wagon for financial reasons, I'm sure, as much as anything, to what's going on in the Northern Hemisphere. It's that's stripped Super Rugby bare.
Yeah.
So the knock on, I mean, that is nowhere near the tournament it was either.
Yeah.
So we've now got 2 crown jewel tournaments, which are not what they were.
Thinking back to
I'm afraid until the governing class, and I use the term loosely because they could not run a bloody tap, until they get a grip on this stuff, I don't get it. It's not an elite tournament anyway. You can't have an elite tournament when 8 teams out of 10 get into it. It's harder not to qualify.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Good.
Listen, that what they've done is they've taken a format and a formula that worked like a dream and trashed it by putting in a format that is a dog's dinner, complete and utter, and encourages an unacceptable element of non-competitiveness.
Absolutely.
Bath. Bath took it was an A side. They took an A side to Benetton, and they lost as a result of it.
Yeah.
And
it was fairly inconsequential.
Yeah.
There's
still a hell of a good game.
It was a great game, but there's every chance they'll qualify still. So no, I agree with all of you. I think in the interest of making things a little bit more upbeat, I just want to single out Toulouse and Antoine Dupont. Guys, do you think? Well, we can sort of predict now, I suppose. Do we see anyone beating Toulouse this year?
Probably not.
It's possible. They've got to fight as ever. They'll be fighting on 2 fronts. And, I think it was Willis who said we got a huge target on our back, and he's right. Every weekend, somebody'd be looking to roll them over. I know that Castro beat them with Will Collier producing a command performance, and he produced another against Munster at the weekend. Somehow England didn't manage to ever see his merits.
Nick always has.
Hey?
Nick, you always have.
Yeah, won't be long before we start talking about props,
Actually, another Englishman abroad, Dave Ribbons, has been doing brilliantly for Toulon, and he's also skippering the side on occasions when Saran is away, just like Willis is skippering Toulouse when Dupont's away. I mean, when's the last time we had 2 English guys skippering major French clubs, if ever?
Maurice Colclough.
Angoulême. Were they major?
But
no, that's a really good point. Actually, I thought Ribbons was phenomenal over the weekend.
Yeah,
it was unique to see Dupont get a standing ovation from an opposition crowd, which I don't think I've ever seen.
Well, it's interesting. I was in Toulouse the year Leinster. The year Leinster beat them with a blinding performance. It might have been in 2009. Actually, the year they won it for the first time, but they went down there perhaps in a semi-final. That rings a distant bell. I might be wrong about it, but they certainly played a big knockout match against Toulouse in Toulouse, and they played a phenomenal game of rugby, Leinster, that day, and had an ovation walking off the field from the Toulouse crowd, which was fantastic. So there's still a bit of the old rugby around. I mean, the reason Toulouse may not just hoover up, because they're the best side in Europe for sure, but by a little bit, I would say. But that top 14 is a ferocious tournament.
Yeah,
it is really hard. You've got people who you should beat who are scrapping for their lives and livelihoods.
Yeah,
and that's what English rugby doesn't have at the moment.
Yeah.
And we've got a Southern Hemisphere model in a football-driven Northern Hemisphere culture.
Yeah,
and the two don't fit. In the end, they don't fit. Not to the satisfaction really of people who have got some purchase in the game. And the French are reaping the dividends of the ferocity of their domestic championship.
Yeah, it's not too fine a point to suggest that Toulouse might even win the Six Nations if they were ever allowed to play it.
Well, I think they would, because they're not as fallible as France. Toulouse, I would think would comfortably win the Six Nations.
Yeah.
As Jack Rowell used to say to his players coming back from England to Bath, that may be good enough for England, young man, but it isn't good enough for us.
Someone did message me to ask me who would beat Toulouse in World Rugby at the moment. The only answer I could come up with was South Africa. That's the only.
That would be a hell of a match. That
would be a stunning match, and I think as good as a matchup as you get, because you're right, they're not as fallible as France are. Other than that, I don't think any other team in the world you could put your hand on your heart and say they beat them.
I mean, what are the thoughts about La Rochelle's victory over Bristol? I mean, Bristol now, I mean, they've had it rough in terms of they drew Leinster and they drew La Rochelle as their first two games, but they're second in the Premiership at the moment, but have been lauded for their style of play and so on and so forth, and they've come up really with a blank in Europe.
Well, it's the Bazball argument in rugby, isn't it? Bazball's wonderful to watch until it goes until it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And you get someone who says, "Well, you may do that in the English Premiership, you lot. That's the way you may play over there, but it doesn't cut any ice here."
But we're gonna tackle you, and
well, if you're going to get down to brass tacks, Nick, we might tackle you instead of wave you through. I was
going to mention Bordeaux.
But I've enjoyed that competition. But to be honest, when you move up a level, and they have moved up a level in the last 2 weeks, it's tough. Mind you, I mean, it doesn't help when you play in Leinster and you only pick one fly off and he gets injured after 7 minutes. That's
that's
an interesting call.
Yeah, very strange that they have no depth in that position now.
Well, especially when you've lost Sheedy and you've lost Yohan Lloyd.
Yeah.
Who, whatever you thought of those players, and they were chalk and cheese, but they could play a game of Premiership level rugby or Champions Cup rugby for you. But they're thin in that position, and McGinty's not the youngest.
No.
Just talking of Bazball a minute, guys. Bordeaux are a sort of French Bazball team, and ordinarily, and they're playing very, very well again. And you'd sort of put them up there as contenders, but we saw what happened when they got absolutely taken apart by Toulouse in the top 14 final. So you hesitate to mention them, but they're again playing extraordinarily good, attractive, attacking rugby. And one of the best sides to watch in Europe, without a doubt.
Yeah. And they're a growing side, aren't they?
Yeah.
I mean, they've got their best in front of them, you would say, Bordeaux. So they're going to be very exciting. I think they'll be real contenders over the next 2 to 3 years. I think. Yeah.
Guys, the time has come for the Rugby Paper Podcast Awards for 2024. I think let's start with Player of the Year. The rest of them we go off script from World Rugby. So hopefully, it involves a little bit more impromptu thinking on behalf of you guys. Player of the Year, World Rugby Player of the Year. I'm going down the fairway with Pieter-Steph du Toit, which I know is the ultimate cop-out, but I'm sure my answers aren't always. So not thought through, I suppose. Chewy, who are you going with?
Dupont.
Despite having played 3 international fixtures.
Extraordinary year. With Toulouse, with the Sevens. I mean, geez. The bloke is... I've said before, I don't like the word great. The bloke is a great rugby player. He is the finest rugby player I have seen in many, many, many moons.
Yeah.
I agree with Chris totally. I got into a slightly heated debate on Twitter with some South Africans who said he's only played a couple of club games this year. Dupont played 14 top 14 matches, was probably man of the match in 14 top 14 matches. He played in 8 Champions Cup matches, was probably man of the match in 8 Champion Cup matches. He skippered the side to the top 14 and to the Champions Cup, and he won an Olympic gold medal. I mean, I love Pieter-Steph du Toit. I also like Eben Etzebeth. I think he deserves a World Player of the Year at some stage. But who is the Rugby Player of the Year, really? It's Antoine Dupont by a million miles.
think I'm being outvoted.
I agree. It's a no contest.
Apart from Will Collier.
Toy is a fantastic player, but Dupont is bloody, he's stellar.
Yeah.
There's no doubt. I mean, if I was looking at somebody else who's who's absolutely X factor, it would be Cheslin Colby. I think he's a phenomenal rugby player, and it's the thing that I love. You love about both of them, but they are the epitome of why rugby is a game for all shapes and sizes still. And that is so important, that young kids can see that if they're not Etzebeth, they can make an even bigger impact as a Colby or obviously as a Dupont. So, yeah.
Let me ask you this, Nick. If you were coaching Dupont, will you turn him into a Lucette?
I'll tell you what, in a 7 scrum, he could definitely do that.
Right,
he bloody well marshaled a driving maul across in the 7s final. Yeah, no.
I mean, Sevens being a game he doesn't play. Yes, he won the gold medal, but the moment he walked into competitive sevens, at international level, he was winning games.
Yeah,
the moment he walked into it.
Yeah,
he's bewilderingly good.
I think that transformation, I mean, the thing that I really admire about him is his guts, because his courage, because that's putting yourself on the line, because it's a different game. It requires a whole different type of fitness, and he just, he smashed it.
Yeah,
absolutely smashed it.
And the other great thing with him, he doesn't ration the genius. The taps are full on all the time. You get the full Monty from Dupont every single game almost he ever plays. And how many genius players were like that? Even the Welsh greats had days off or didn't even play sometimes. But, Gareth Edwards, I think he played at Pontypool once in his career. Saved it for the bigger matches. Dupont just pours it on all the time, relentless. Even Cheslin Colby, 3 tries in the Japanese league season. This is their gala, their main player, the side. He's just constant with Dupont. He can't help himself.
No.
Yeah.
No. I mean, just going back to the sevens, it was funny that France had been in maybe 4 or 5 7 series by the time he came in for that season, and they hadn't had a look in. And all of a sudden, he came in and they were in a final. And then he came in the week after and they won the thing. And then he came in for the finals in Madrid and they won that. And then he came in for the Olympics and then they won that as well.
It's no coincidence.
It's no coincidence. Like it's just not. There were 4 or 5. The 4 or 5 tournaments he featured in, they were a feature in, and then he went away, and all of a sudden, so did they. That being said, they've started phenomenally well.
Yeah, they started well this year.
This year, certainly relative to last year, but hopefully that means that it's just, we'll call it Dupont's engine. I've been outvoted there. More than happy to be. My team of the year is sort of more in line with that is Toulouse. Quite simply because I think it's so rare that you have a domestic side that you think could take on the titans of the world and do a number on several of them. They got what they came for earlier this year. I think they're going to get what they come for next year as well. So I think in terms of complete sides, Toulouse by a mile on the domestic front and globally as well in terms of what they've achieved.
And leaving aside the usual suspects, 9, 10, 15, who were all wonderful players at their best, and Dupont's wonderful all the time. The emergence of Rouma at number 8 as a back row forward of unusual skill and instinct and game intelligence has done quite a lot to lift them up another half a level, and they were pretty high anyway. But once you've got that spine, I mean, they're strong at hooker, as we know. You've got Rouma at number 8, Dupont, Entomac, Ramos. Crikey.
Yeah.
Crikey.
Hey, what about Kinghorn?
Oh, yeah. Well, what, the Lions fullback?
Yeah.
Interesting. Hot take. We'll get to that.
He's not the worst either, is he? And he's going to be better from going through that environment and standing his ground, which he is doing.
And the thing about Toulouse is that they almost haven't changed in 30 years. I mean, I think this is probably the best Toulouse side I've seen, but they always give it full Monty. They always put out a full side in Europe. They always play with invention. They like, they like the biff up front. They sort that out as well. But there's an absolute template of excellence from Toulouse, and they adorn the game, really. I mean, without Toulouse, you could have some pretty, competitions that are pretty mundane, really, in Europe. With Toulouse, it elevates everything. We are watching one of the.
How many did they have, Brendan, in the last 30 years?
Well, the bloke before was about 22 years, wasn't he? And now they've had Mollard for about 8 years. And that's it. Constancy.
Are we going Skrela, Noves, Mollard?
Yes, Skrela, Noves, Mollard would probably be the last 30 years. 3 coaches.
Surely, it's like the New Yorker magazine, which has had 5 editors in 100 years. I mean, it's the value. No, and that is true. That is true. It's the value of continuity.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's absolutely extraordinary. And Saracens, who were, the most successful, I suppose, of the English sides in more recent memory, they learned that lesson. Nigel Ray went from having a coach a year for several years to landing on Mark McCall via sort of Brendan Venter, and McCall's been in situ, and you can make those changes to the team. You can feed players through because you've just got a continuity of thought of what you're trying to do, and that's priceless. And Toulouse,
Jack Rowell at Bath. Jack Rowell at Bath.
Yeah, well, indeed. Well, that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. Stuart Barnes lost 9 games in 10 years at Bath under Jack. 9 games in 10 years. It's ridiculous. But that's what you get if you've got someone that committed. And it's a two-way street, of course, isn't it? The club itself needs to respond to you in the way that you're responding to the club environment and shaping the club environment. But if you've got that quintessence, if you've got that combination of forces in place, why would you get rid of it? It's why you laugh when Manchester City you lose 3 or 4 games and everyone says, "Oh, Pep Guardiola's finished. Pep must go. Pep must go." What's up with these people?
Does anyone have any other teams they'd add to the list, either national or domestic?
Any other team to add to the list?
For team of the year, I mean, are we unanimous that it's Toulouse?
No. We're not.
That was
Go on, then.
I would say that the team of the year is South Africa. I don't see anybody to. And as we say, if Toulouse did play South Africa, I think that would be the one game that they'd come unstuck in. So
South Africa or Toulouse?
Toulouse would.
I don't know. I'm not sure. I'd put my money on against Toulouse in a match that mattered.
Yeah, well, I would. South Africa have the fantastic thing about what they've done is that they've kicked on after a World Cup. No dip, no English collapse. Having reached Everest, they've pushed on. Erasmus, while he may wind a lot of people up, is still a consummate selector. He's the best selector that I can see anywhere. And, for him to keep bringing them together from all their, corners of the earth and producing teams of that caliber, intent, with that sort of competition for places that's going on, that's pushing them all onwards, I think that I'd give it to them.
Toulouse would never have lost that match in Argentina, Nick.
Yes, they bloody would.
I don't think they would. That's a good point, actually. If Toulouse had played South Africa's fixtures this year, would they have ended up losing twice? I don't think they would.
Okay, well,
personally,
let's smash the crystal ball.
A slightly less obvious one, and it's certainly less obvious than last year. I mean, last year, obviously, the match of the year was one of the 2 Rugby World Cup quarterfinals, no question. This year may be less obvious. I'll throw it to the floor on this one, and if anyone has any immediate picks, then fire them.
The one I enjoyed the most was England-Australia, which was just a joy as a fan to watch. Helter-skelter, some great rugby, unexpected Aussie resilience, some very fine rugby from England at times. And it just had a feel-good factor about it, which, I enjoyed the Argentinian wins. They were great as well, but it was maybe the one over Australia ought to be highlighted. But I just enjoyed England-Australia as a spectacle more than any match, I think.
I'm with Bren on that, and I would go further to say that it may well prove in hindsight, which is where we all live, of course, to be the most influential or significant of the games, because my God, how the Wallabies needed a bit of a rejuvenation, or a lot of a rejuvenation, and the worldwide game needed them to have a rejuvenation. And the way they won that game, I mean, had they lost, or had that game's turned out slightly differently for them, and they'd lost by a few, I'm not sure how they'd be feeling about themselves now. But your suspicion is, I know they didn't do the slam they allegedly promised themselves, but they'll be feeling a whole lot better about what's coming, both the Lions and hosting the World Cup in the foreseeable future. I think they'll feel a whole lot better about themselves. And much as we all like to see the Australian sports teams finish second more often than we want them to win, I'm sure I'm not being controversial in saying that rugby does need them to be good. And that if that game turns out to be the launching pad for a good Wallaby side, then it was worth the English defeat.
Yeah, it definitely shows that they've got the makings of more depth, and that's the thing that they've always, or at least I say not always, but that they've struggled with for the last 2 decades almost is having those players who can come in, and they brought some players through. Jorgensen is an obvious, with his try against England, but he looked. In games that I saw in the Rugby Championship, they looked tentative. Their confidence was blown, and that game just bloody gave them that injection of confidence that they needed. Wasn't enough to carry them past either Scotland or Ireland, but it's definitely a better signpost for them. The match of the season was Toulouse-Leinster. In that European Cup final. I think it showcased everything that we've been talking about Dupont, but also showcased that England have a great absentee flanker who's, in Jack Willis, whose performance in that game was absolutely outstanding in every respect, both sides of the ball, carrying, tackling, jackling, etc. So for me, and it was a game. It was like, watching a great heavyweight bout, really, because it went back and forth with, people absorbing the other's best shots, coming off the ropes, even climbing off the canvas. And in the end, the better side won to foil Leinster, I think, I can't remember, I think it was the fourth final, not on the trot, but fourth final they'd lost in succession. So
and it's very interesting you should mention Willis in a Lions year where the favourite for the Lions 7 jersey in a lot of books, I'm not saying everyone's, is still Josh van der Fleer.
And merited as well.
Crikey! And I think he having taken a bit of a step backwards for a while, I think he's on the way up again. He's playing extremely well, but Jack Willis is there with him.
Yeah,
but Jack Willis, I think that Jack Willis definitely shaded him in that game.
Yeah, that may well be the case. And if he's up there blow for blow, and he's not picked for the Lions because he's playing he's an exile, then it just shows that all is not straightforward in selection policy, either with England or with the Lions, if he doesn't.
And the other factor there is that Jack Willis is also playing quite a bit at number 8 for Toulouse, and his carrying has improved off the scale, and he's now a pretty good impression of his brother Tom, ball in hand, plus all his other great skills at the breakdown. So there's a bit of wiggle room there in the Lions back row, I think. There would have been a special award for Jack Willis. I mean, 2 years ago, this is a guy whose club went bust, couldn't get a contract in England, went to Toulouse. I mean, obviously a player of known quality, but Toulouse took a punt, as they often do. Toulouse are fantastic spotters of talent, and that bloke has just transformed himself into one of the world's best. He's an absolute legend down there. The crowd love him. He captains the side when Dupont's away, and what a story! You know, Phoenix from the ashes. Really, his has been the last 2 years.
He could win the award as the unselectable player of the year.
I mean, there is a back row. There is a Lions back row that accommodates Willis, Van der Fleer, and Doris. It's almost all of them could wear 6, 7, or 8. So
Willis would have to play 8. That's where probably because Doris is.
Or Doris plays 6. But yeah, you're right.
No.
Doris plays 8. Willis plays 6.
Yeah,
that would be it. Yeah.
But no, you're right. He definitely deserves a shout out. I'm going to be cheeky and pick 2 matches, but only because they happened on the same day. And that was Italy, Scotland, and England, Ireland back to back, which I felt was probably the best day of rugby of the year, no doubt, and injected the Six Nations and us English fans in particular, and I'm sure Italy fans as well, with a much needed sort of lease of life, which I just remember the adrenaline of that afternoon was something else. So I wanted to give that afternoon a shout out, even if it meant bending the rules slightly, which is fine because I make them. So you know, that's all good.
So you bend your own rules?
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Definition of fascism, isn't it?
Agreed, and that's what this podcast is. Podcast. I mean, speaking of podcast episode of the year, guys. This is the most.
Beam me up, Scotty, in a minute.
We've obviously had. I think we've had more guests than we've ever had this year. Almost more episodes as well. I think we maybe had 1 week off in the summer, so it's been a pretty relentless year. I've narrowed it down to a top 6.
Oh, you never make a selector, Ollie. God. I've narrowed the scrum half spot down to 6 players.
I'll tell you what, he's pretty decisive, old Ollie, isn't he? Crikey. Oh, God.
I'm going to hold off for exactly that reason. Guys, what stands out from the year?
Oh, yeah, mate.
Oh, the silence is great. Cheers, lads.
Luke Pearce. Luke Pearce was brilliant. Wasn't it great to talk to a ref? No holds barred. He admits mistakes. He knows when he gets it wrong, but also he tells us what he's trying to do, and we understand what he's trying to do. And I would just wish more refs. In fact, we did well this year. We had a couple of refs, didn't we, in TMOs? Yeah. I just wish they could do that more often. It would help the game a lot.
Yeah. Well, I mean, two of mine were refs. One was Luke, and one was Nigel Owens as well.
Yeah, they're both good.
Which just felt like a privilege above all, to be honest.
I thought Campo appearing again, I thought was as ever controversial, entertaining. He slammed Joe Schmidt and said, "We don't want a Kiwi coaching Australia. It's not, he knows nothing about Australian rugby, so on and so forth." And but the one thing that you would say is that Schmidt is a coach with a track record, and he has improved them. So from pretty inauspicious beginnings as well.
Yeah.
I always enjoyed Campo coming on.
Yeah. We'll get him back on in future for sure. He's very good to us. Is Campo, and he was mentioned last year, of course, in the podcast episodes of the year as well. Chewy, what would yours be?
I thought, hey, look, Campo's. I don't disagree with any of you guys. And of course, we're such an unbelievably good panel that we make everyone sound good anyway. it's interesting that Nigel Owens is the only person around Welsh rugby at the moment good enough to justify a place on the podcast.
Cannot be the Welshman we've had on this year.
So maybe our brethren to the west of the Severn will look at themselves a little bit more intently and see if they can up their game and get a few more on next season. I do think actually in a random way, I enjoyed the Craig Doyle session because it was just very funny. And he was very open and full of good stories and full of bonhomie. It was just an hour well spent, really, or an hour and a half probably. In that case, it was just a lot of fun. It's in the end, it's just rugby, isn't it? Even the people you think might be a little bit reserved, or maybe need a bit more prodding and pushing to get something out of them. Over the course of a chat like this, it is, the value of it is like chatting to someone in the bar after a game and swapping a few stories and arguing the toss over a few points. And that's the value of the podcast. And basically, from the very young guys like Jack Kenningham last week, who couldn't have been more forthcoming, really, given the fact that he's a player and there's only so much he can say on any subject without dropping himself in a mess. He was hugely entertaining. So you go from someone like Jack to somebody who's been there and done it all, like Nigel Owens or whoever, Campo, and that's the value of the podcast. It's rugby chat, and there's no other sporting chat like it, really.
100%. Craig Doyle was also on my list of 6. I'll give a shout out. I'll give a shout out to one more, which was Thomas Appleton.
Terrific.
He was fantastic, and to be able to relive, I'm sure he was probably fed up of speaking about it. Well, maybe not with something like that had happened, but to relive that Portuguese win over Fiji with him was fairly surreal, actually. So certainly do go back and give that a listen if you haven't just yet, because he was fantastic.
And there's a bit to be said for the Maxime Mermoz episode as well, because firstly, Mermoz was extraordinarily blunt in some of his views, and, to the point where you're just going through your Fido Facts looking for your lawyer's number. And secondly, of course, Ollie, we could hear you in full flight with your enviable linguistic skills.
Thanks, Chewy. That's the first time you've ever shouted out my intellect.
It was very good, and it left me thinking that you'd make a hell of a lot more sense if you conducted everything in French.
Coming to you in the new year, Le Rugby Paper Podcast.
Talking about forthright, was Mark Cueto in this year or not?
No, he was last year. He was last year.
Or even this planet.
Yeah, that's potentially true. I do want to shout out Alex Cuthbert and Jonathan Davis as well as the off the top of my head, the other two Welsh representatives that featured on the podcast. I'll wrap my brains and think if there were any more. We do have a Welshman in the pipeline for the new year. Richard Hibbard will be coming on during the Six Nations. We've already got some great guests lined up. Jason Leonard is one, Matt Fagerson's another, Lewis Liner is another. So plenty to look forward to already. And I can't wait to see what the stuff we don't know about the podcast is for 2025. So gents, thanks for keeping me company always. And yeah, see you in the new year.
Yeah.
Happy Christmas to everybody.
Happy Christmas to everyone.
Thanks for listening to this week's edition of the Rugby Paper Podcast. And don't forget to subscribe on whichever podcast platform you use and recommend the show to your friends. The Rugby Paper is available to buy every Sunday, and to make sure you don't miss it, subscribe through our print, digital and online options at therugbypaper.co.uk/subscriptions. That's therugbypaper.co.uk/subscriptions to get all our content for as little as 14p per day.